So, first of all, I'm hoping that you guys have had a chance to read. So those of you who are here, how you feeling? Do you love it? Do you hate it?
I read it all in one sitting, and after I finished it, I was like, damn, I need to like get a drink and sit out and look at the rain wistfully, because this was depressing.
Samesies. Yeah, I finished the book and then I just sat there for a while and just kind of looked at nothing. And it is deeply depressing. And on one hand, I apologize for that. Like, I know that we're already having quite a summer. And we would probably all really rather look at baby otter videos. But at the same time, I feel like it is my responsibility to point out that very often war is stupid. Because again, y'all will be in charge of America here in about 5 minutes. And I need you to know about the mistakes that we've already made so that you can make new and different mistakes. That's the goal, right? It's the goal of history. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you guys thought about this book. Because I thought it's deeply engaging, but it is sad and different. So what we're going to do today is talk mostly about the characters and the themes. So yesterday we talked a lot about the book itself and who wrote it and how it was received and how, in a lot of ways, it was kind of a tipping point for the Nazi Party, especially in regard to what they could control in the media. And so today we're just going to dive right into the book itself. So I shall commence sharing my screen. All right. So today we are going to start with the characters. Oh, we were going to start with the characters. I seem to have pressed the wrong button. So I'm sorry about that, y'all. From current slide, there we go. One day I'll figure out computers. All right, so one of the reasons that I wanted you to read this book, or that I chose this book for y'all specifically this semester, was because these guys, in a lot of ways, are similar to you. You know, they're kind of roughly your age. They're, facing sort of unprecedented worldwide crisis. So I was curious, I think, about how you would react to them deciding to join the war and how you would react to the way that they faced their sort of daily travails. So let's start with the main character. So Paul Baumer is kind of the everyman. He's just sort of a guy. He's from a sort of rural town in Germany. There's nothing particularly great about him. They never really even describe him. They describe a lot of the other characters. We know that some of them are tall, and some of them are fat, and some of them are old. But Paul is just neutral. And so the idea that, we think, is that the author kind of designed him to be an everyman, so that you can imagine yourself being Paul, so that you can imagine your son being Paul, because he's sort of meant to represent the first person viewpoint. So most of the story is told from Paul's point of view, of course. So it does introduce a little bit of bias because, of course, he is a frontline soldier. He's not, one of the exciting airmen. He's not one of the generals in charge of the thing. He's not one of the, people waiting at home for the soldiers to come back. He's literally boots on the ground. So in that regard, he's a very powerful narrator because he's telling a very real, very explicit version of what happened to him. And keep in mind, this really all did happen, especially specifically to the author. So one of the things that, and we talked about this a lot yesterday, but one of the things that was new and different and rare about this book was that it was a first-person account, and we hadn't really seen something like that before. So even though Paul is not Eric, he is still representative of the soldier experience and that sort of everyman dilemma. So for a lot of these, I didn't put pictures because, there's no pictures in a book. For some of them, we'll see the pictures of the first movie because I thought that might be slightly more understandable. So here's Paul. And here are all of his school friends. So one of the things that they talked about in the book was the way that they were sort of talked into joining. And all of them did. And that's one of the things that we'll look at later, this peer pressure to join. So he and I think there's 7 of them total, of his schoolmates are talked into this by their schoolmaster, and they join the war, and a lot of them serve in the same battalion. So this is something that we have also stopped doing. This was something that we noticed being relatively problematic in the Civil War, because one of the things that happened was that a lot of boys from the same town, and sometimes brothers, would join the same battalion, and then they would all die at once in the same battle. And so that would really decimate towns, and it would certainly destroy families. So one of the things that they started doing, especially in World War II, was like spreading people out. And you've probably seen this, right? If you saw Saving Private Ryan, the whole point was that they put him somewhere else than his brothers. But in World War I, it was still relatively common if a bunch of people from the same town wanted to join the same branch, that they would sort of go together. So Paul and his boys, and these are not Paul and his boys, these are just some German soldiers who know each other. They basically, again, represent the everyman. They are all the soldiers. They are perfectly representative of all the German boys who joined up because they have the same motives, which is basically protect the fatherland and also don't look like a cowardly bitch. And they have the same sort of experience, which is, wow, we thought this would be amazing, and instead, mostly it's shooting. So one of the things that I wanted to point out was that over the course of the story, most of them die. Joseph Beam dies immediately, and the others have a much more gradual process. And so part of the story really is that the people that you know are going to suffer a fate that you cannot control. Sorry, I'm going to unshare for a second so I can mute this person. Who's making all that noise? Sam Clements? All right, there he goes. I'm just teasing Sam Clements. I'm not mad at you. So basically, over the course of the story, we get to know these people, and we see what's going on in their lives, and we see what's going on in their war experience. And so when some of them eventually do die, it's a lot more harrowing for us. They're not strangers. They're people that Paul went to school with. They're people that we've been following this whole time. So the fact that, 6 out of 7 of them die, we don't really know what happens to Albert Kropp. He's he's injured and then possibly sent to another battalion, so we don't know for sure if he lived or died. But over the course of the story, we become attached to these dudes, and we know that Paul has to go home and tell their parents what happened, that he has to, take their personal effects back to the town and back to where he used to assume that they would all come back to. So over the course of the story, we meet all of these boys, and then all of them die. And again, hyper-realistic. The sort of bad guy, if you will, is Kantorek. So, it's German, so probably Kantorek. So Kantorek is the schoolmaster, and he's a great character because sometimes we sort of need an anti-hero, sometimes we need somebody to push the narrative forward, but also to believe that they're doing the right thing. So Kantorek really sincerely believes that he is doing the right thing. He talks all of these boys into joining this war. Essentially, he kind of talks them into walking face forward into their death. But you could argue that he doesn't know that. He probably also believes that this war will be relatively quick. It will be relatively easy. And he's sending these boys out to defend their homeland and gain some glory. So he makes all of these speeches about war effort and patriotism and the fatherland, and basically he sort of gasses them up. He talks up this war like it's going to be this great big old intense party. The thing that is interesting about him is that he's a massive hypocrite. He doesn't do it himself. He doesn't enlist. He doesn't go to the front. He doesn't send his own children. I don't think he has any children. Towards the end, when they start to really call up the reserves because they're running out of young men because they're all dead, they do call him up, and he does come to the front, and the boys are able to kind of exact their revenge on this guy because, he talks a big game and he does nothing. But again, that's typical of the higher up powers. This is one of the things that we're going to sort of, we'll talk about for sure tomorrow, but we'll talk about next week as well, the differing perspective between the people with power and the people without. And so the people who aren't personally involved talk a good game. And Kantorek is sort of the epitome of those guys. The people being you should enlist, you should go fight, this is going to be amazing, but they don't do it. So if you hated him, you probably were supposed to. The next character who's especially interesting is Kat. So Stanislaus Katczinsky is the oldest member of their group. So in the group, it's mostly him, sort of his schoolmates, and a couple of other guys who are their age. And then there's Kat. And Kat's a really fascinating character because he's meant to be more worldly wise than the others. He's really good at scavenging. He's got a sort of questionable moral code. He's just definitely not above stealing for sure. And on the one hand, you're sort of glad when he steals things, right? Because he comes home with something and you're like, ooh, butter, or ooh, food. So in a sense, because you're biased on Paul's behalf, you're kind of delighted by Kat's thievery. On the other hand, that's generally considered immoral. So he's sort of an interesting case study in regard to like the ethics of war and like what a soldier owes to the surrounding landscape and what a soldier owes to people who have already died. Because you may recall at the very beginning, there's this scene where the cook is making enough food for their whole battalion because he doesn't know that half of them died yesterday. And so Kat's one of the people who's like double rations for everybody. So in a sense, he's really valuable because he's such a good scavenger and he puts himself and, you know, his boys first. But in another sense, he's not supposed to be like a hero. He's not supposed to be somebody we're supposed to idolize. So he brings a lot of perspective to the group because, again, he's the oldest and he's the most sort of cynical. So he's the guy that really addresses what they're going through, but not through rose-colored glasses, like specifically through like dark, cynical glasses. This picture here is how they portrayed him in the 1930 movie. And I just thought it was kind of interesting. He's so fat and lazy. So the real bad guy is Himmelstoss. I love Himmelstoss. So he's, again, the outright epitome of hypocrisy. So he's a corporal, but he's also sort of power hungry, and he's really abusive and he's really vindictive. And he's one of those people who, you know, appears to believe that if you smush other people down, you will yourself become taller. And again, you've probably seen something like this. Like this is a relatively common thing that we see in villains, but you may have seen it in your real life as well. This idea that people with a sort of like low center of self-confidence will push it outwards to other people, you know, will like, you know, insult and push down and degrade other people with this sort of like falsified belief that it will make them be better. It doesn't, it just creates more hatred all the way around. But he's a great example of this. So basically he's like abusive to these boys when he's training them. You know, he's unnecessarily stingy with like rations. You know, physically he asks them to do a lot of things that are irrational. And then later he's called up too. So one of the things that's really interesting about the book is the fact that they address that, number one, the Germans ran out of soldiers, and number two, sometimes when you really face reality, it's not what you thought it would be. And so for Himmelstoss, when he really faces reality, it's not what he thought it would be. Because at the end-ish of the war, he is called to the front lines, and he hasn't been on the front lines before. All he did was train soldiers, like way back where it was safe. And so when he's called to the front lines, as it turns out, a cowardly little bitch. Which again, not surprising, because the kind of people who act this way are always people who are cowards deep down. But it is satisfying a little bit in a way, because by the time he gets to the front, the boys are done. They are done with respecting authority, especially false authority. They are done with this guy in particular, and they literally physically beat him. And of course, generally, I am opposed to physical violence because that's not how we should solve our problems. But on the other hand, sometimes it's very satisfying when you see an imaginary bad person, imaginary get beat. But it's kind of interesting that they do physically beat him up and yell at him and call him names, but then he sort of redeems himself. So it's sort of like they get it out of their systems and they're like, you were wrong and you did a bad thing and we have punished you and now here we go forward. So it's sort of like redeeming, it's sort of like reparations almost in a way. Like as soon as they finally finish punishing him for what he did previously, they allow him to join the fold. So Himmelstoss is super hateable. And if you ever decide to watch one of the movie versions, which I hope you didn't do first because you're really missing out. But if you ever decide to, you'll see he's just the worst. So I also wanted to talk about some of the more minor characters. So there's a couple of people who, for instance, are in their battalion, like Jaden. Even though I can mostly speak German, I have never been able to pronounce the T and the J at the same time. That's one of those things you have to learn when you're little. It's basically like Jaden, but native German speakers tell me I do it wrong. But I love him. So he's the one who's like the peat farmer, and he's really big and strong and hungry all of the time. And he's interesting because he's relatively positive. He sort of serves as a counterbalance to Kat, because Kat is so objectively cynical and Tjaden is sort of objectively positive. So they have this sort of counterbalance relationship, and there's a great conversation coming up, which we'll read out loud. So he is just, you know, he's sort of one of the sideline characters, but he mostly provides a foil to the major characters. Similarly, Dettering, I love him. So Dettering is the one who's the farmer who thinks only of his farm. Like constantly they're trying to get him to focus on what's going on. They're trying to get him involved in the war effort, but all he wants to think about is like his wife and his farm and what they're doing and how he's not there helping and he needs to go home for the harvest. And he's the one who one day is under a cherry tree, like this one, and it just sort of has this moment and he's just like, yeah, no, fuck it, I'm going home. He, you know, he's overwhelmed with the beauty, to be sure, but also I think he has a sort of like out of body moment where he looks at this tree and he's like, oh, the world is beautiful. It's just not beautiful here. Like, this is stupid. Cherry tree is good. And so he deserts. And of course you can't do this. So probably they hunt him down and kill him, although we never really find out. But Dettering is sort of, again, symbolic of people who choose to turn their back on ugliness and face beauty. And then finally, of course, Lieutenant Bertnick, and he is the one who is honorable. So again, in an effort to sort of balance out the characters, he's the one who sort of plays the foil to Himmelstoss. So Bertnick is the guy who agrees that they should like share the rations. He's the guy who like kind of tries to take care of the troops. He's the only one of the officers who kind of shows honor and who shows like a real care for the soldiers, like as human beings and not just as sort of cannon fodder. So he exists again to be the opposite. So that kind of rounds out our characters. And the reason that I wanted to go through and tell you about who they were was because I wanted to be clear about a couple things. And one, you know, the everyman character, and two, the way that each of the characters in a lot of ways represented people who were real. They represented the soldiers who were cynical. They represented the soldiers who were hopeful. They represented the shitty corporals. They represented the good corporals. So in this book, he only had a few characters, right? Like, it's not like Game of Thrones or something, but at the same time he managed to create a relatively complete world in regard to the kinds of people he saw and like what they represented. So not very many characters, but an excellent selection of characters, especially in regard to the polarizing. All right, so now let's talk about the themes. So again, it does get kind of dark. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is this idea of why people join a war. And this is something that you should be reckoning with right now in regard to your interview paper. Because one of the things that I think is really important to question, especially in regard to when you have the option of doing first-person analysis, why we decide to do a thing. So one of the things that they talk about really clearly in this book is this idea of patriotism. And it's patriotism bordering on nationalism, to be sure. Like, it's a little bit like, you know, Deutschland über alles, like, not like I love my country, but like my country's better than yours. You know, there's sort of a line that they cross. But Kantorek, basically, as the schoolmaster, feeds them a lot of propaganda. And on a to be fair, it's sort of his job, but on the other hand, like, he's literally sending these boys out to die. So this is one of the things that he says to them. And this is sort of Paul reflecting on the way that it was. Because he talked about how Kantorek gave them these lectures and how he basically taught them that the thing that they needed to do was get involved in this war, was serve their country, was go forward. And he said, I can see him now as he used to glare at us through his spectacles and say in a moving voice, won't you join up with us, comrades? And again, it's kind of amazing because he says us, right? Like, we know for a fact that Kantorek isn't serving. He does later, but he's not at the time. So this idea that he's pressuring them to join something that even he himself is not prepared to join is very, very important. That hypocrisy is very important. So when they think back on this, especially when they start to see their schoolmates die, the very schoolmates that Kantorek talked into this, one of the things that they think about is whether they should hold him accountable, whether his, you know, these lectures, these super patriotic lectures, are essentially at fault, especially for the death of these really young boys. And he argues that basically they cannot. So he says, naturally, we couldn't blame Kantorek for this. Where would the world be if one brought every man to book? Sorry, this is kind of an old-fashioned phrase, but to bring someone to book is sort of like when they say throwing the book at them, like in a court of law. It basically means to write down in the book, like that you would have in like the town courthouse, what the person did wrong. So to bring somebody to book is essentially to like legally recognize what they've done. Sorry, okay. There were thousands of Kantoreks, all of whom were convinced that they were acting for the best in a way that cost them nothing. That's the important part. all of them were convinced that they were doing what was right, right? Like all of them is presumably like sincerely believed that this was the thing that we had to do, that this war was just, that these boys should involve, but in a way that cost them nothing. They weren't going themselves. They were just making speeches. And so the very next sentence is what Paul recognizes, and that is why they let us down so badly. And again, this is one of the things that I kind of want you to learn from the book, is this idea that sometimes when people make these speeches at you, they might be acting in a hypocritical manner. That sometimes when people want you to do something like this, you need to think about, what does it cost them? Are they prepared to lose you? Are you just a number? Are you just cannon fodder? Because what he's sort of reflecting back on, what Paul is reflecting back on, is the power of these speeches and yet the hypocrisy of these speeches. So he's really looking at Kantorek and thinking like, well, there were thousands of them. Clearly schoolmasters all over the country talked their soldiers into joining. It didn't cost them anything, and is it now their fault? Like, should we somehow hold them to account, or should we just acknowledge what they did? So I think this might be sort of the difference between like cancel culture and call out culture, right? Which we'll talk about tomorrow. But this idea that should we acknowledge they were bad or should we throw them in jail is kind of what they're dealing with while they're on the front lines. So another thing that I thought was especially interesting was that when he was thinking about why people go to war and the start of the war, one of the things that he noticed was that people were not equally patriotic about this. People were not equally excited. And one of the things that he noticed was that the poor people essentially had a different perspective than the others. So he says the wisest were just the poor and simple people. They knew the war to be a misfortune, whereas those who were better off and should have been able to see more clearly what the consequences would be were beside themselves with joy. And this is always a constant theme with war. War tends to be very good for the economy, but not good for everybody in the economy, if you know what I mean. So like very often, something that makes a lot of money, like especially for instance, war tends to create a lot of money, but it doesn't create money for everybody. It creates money for the people who own the factories, and it creates money for the people who have, contracts that they worked out with the government employees. It does not create money for the poorest among us, and it does not create money for the people who were just kind of chilling peacefully on their farms. And so one of the things that Paul notices is that the people who do stand to make money, or at least the people who are relatively removed from the war itself, are super excited. But the people who have seen this shit before and the people who know kind of that they're going to be the ones who have to go to the front line, not excited. So again, this is something that I want you to be able to look for in the future, that I want you to be able to sort of look, when you see something like this, when you see people trying to get you to join a movement, I want you to look at the perspectives of everybody whom it might impact. Because again, what you might notice is that the people at the bottom are looking at this and they're like, oh, this is just more bullshit. And the people at the top are looking at this and they're like, oh, I'm gonna get so rich, right? So you have to really, I think, carefully consider what people stand to gain. And what Paul noticed was that the poor and the simple pretty much knew that their farms were going to get destroyed and everybody was going to die. And the wealthy and the sort of disengaged knew that their farms were going to get destroyed and everybody was going to die, but it was going to turn out well for them. So this is something that's very important.
Also,
I'm sorry, what?
I just think that perspectives also apply to mission trips.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
Preaching your religion.
Yeah, we see a lot of this when like rich white children go and they sort of pose with like the poor native children, and then like the sort of exploitative mission trips. This is one of those things that can be very useful and it can be very exploitative.
And it doesn't have to be just war. You can find perspectives in a lot of different facets of life. Yeah.
That is the goal of the class. So this perspective that they were having going into this movement was something that, again, I want you to kind of keep in your brains, because I want you to be able to think about why someone might have the perspective that they have when they're asking you to do something. So for Paul, noticing this was a bit of a sea change moment. Like he noticed that this might not have been something that everybody thought about equally. So one of the people that he points out who had a different perspective than the rest of them was one of his schoolmates, the boy Joseph. And so he noticed that Joseph, in fact, wasn't really on board with the whole thing. And I wanted you to kind of look at these quotes again because I think they're quite important. So he says, "There was indeed one of us who hesitated and did not want to fall into line. That was Joseph Bim, a plump, homely fellow. But he did allow himself to be persuaded. Otherwise, he would have been ostracized." And again, peer pressure, so strong. So strong. And I'm not saying that you would be wrong to fall in line with peer pressure. We literally all do it. Often it's worse when we're younger and kind of fades as we get older, but not always, does it? So for Joseph to fear being ostracized, especially when he was 18, especially when the rest of the country was really involved in something, is totally understandable. He didn't want to be left out. He didn't want to be, sort of shat upon. He wanted to do the thing that everybody else was doing and prove that he was as good as them and as brave as them and as strong as them. But of course, what ended up happening was that the one boy who didn't want to go was the one who died first. So he noted, perhaps more of us thought as he did, but no one could very well stand out, because at that time, even one's parents were ready with the word coward. No one had the vaguest idea what we were in for. So again, one would imagine that with historical perspective, we would be able to look at wars and be like, oh, I bet this next one will be dumb too, but we never do, right? So even for poor little baby Joseph, even his parents were ready to call him a coward for not joining. So in a way, I think it's very understandable that he made this choice. I think it's very rational that he didn't want to be left out, that he wanted to do the thing that everybody was saying would be so great. And it was the worst possible outcome that it would turn out like he thought it would turn out. So again, it can be very hard to be the person who's going against the grain. It can be really scary, and people really are going to call you a coward. And so I think in a way it's really understandable that you might not want to, but sometimes you got to listen to your instincts as well. So another one of the things that the book sort of made clear was how the soldiers survived this. Because in a lot of ways, it was the darkest thing that they had ever seen. It was the worst conditions they'd ever been in. And one of the things that we very often see when people are in conditions that are this bad is what we call gallows humor. And the idea is that this sort of like black humor helps us get through it. And you've probably seen something like this. You've probably seen people making sort of dark jokes, especially in really dire circumstances. It's not like the Germans invented this. But one of the ways that Paul sort of explains what's going on for him and for his fellow soldiers is by explaining that they did what they had to do to get through it. So he says the terror of the front seeks deep down when we turn our backs upon it. We make grim, coarse jests about it. When a man dies, we say he has nipped off his turd. And so we speak of everything. That keeps us from going mad. As long as we take it that way, we maintain our own resistance. So essentially this idea that they are trying to sort of control the narrative in such a way that they can make jokes to sort of crack the darkness or ease the burden. He says, we don't like that because we're in a good humor. We're in a good humor because otherwise we should go to pieces. And again, this is one of the things that we'll talk about tomorrow, but I imagine you've seen at least a low-level version of this, like people cracking jokes when they're in a really bad situation, or maybe you've sort of been there, and it helps. It helps with camaraderie. It helps with facing the thing that you're facing, and humans are delicate, and sometimes we need to sort of lighten our load, or we need to approach something with humor to just like allow our brains to wrap themselves around it. So for the Germans, especially, this was extremely common. Over here on the left, you can see them smiling at their homemade latrine. There's a whole section in the book about like just how casual everyone was about pooping. And one of the things that they sort of acknowledged was that especially in a war like this, you've really got to let go of like your embarrassment about bodily functions, because everyone else is going through exactly the same thing, and also there's nowhere to hide. So typically the Germans would build latrines sort of like this. It'd be like sort of one long flat log, and everybody would sit on the flat log, and they would dig a trench underneath it, and then occasionally they would just sort of move the log and fill the trench in, which, super gross. I'm so glad we have running water. But joking about it was sort of what allowed them to live through it. So literally latrine humor was one of the things that allowed them to like process the darkness of what was going on, and to sort of reframe the narrative in such a way that they could say what they needed to say and keep themselves from going to pieces. So similarly, sometimes even the darkest humor is not going to save you. And one of the things that this book deals with, and again for the first time, is what happens to the soldiers when they go home. So in World War I, they called it shell shock. These days we have a lot of different words for it. We had different words for it in World War II and in Vietnam, but these days we call it PTSD, of course. But he notices and outright says that this is a difficult thing. So he says, and this I know, all of these things that now, while we are still in a war, sink down in us like a stone, after the war shall waken again, and then we shall begin the disentanglement of life and death. These days, the weeks, the years out here shall come back again. And of course, he's right. This is exactly how human brains work. Very often when we're going through something, we sort of black out. Like it's sometimes considered like a flight or fight response. Like very often people who are going through something excessively traumatic sort of just like shut down their thought capabilities. This is really common for people who are undergoing some sort of assault, especially. And so what the soldiers all did was just sort of like push it down. Like, we will deal with this later. Like, today we are going to make jokes and we are going to steal food. And then when we get home, this is going to come back up because that's what happens. And that is what happened. But for today, we have to sort of push this down. So this is one of the reasons that people got so upset about this book. Because prior to this was not something that we talked about. This was not something that we acknowledged. And this was not something that we felt like men should feel. For a long time, we've been going through this sort of phase with masculinity where men aren't really supposed to have feelings, and if they do, they're not supposed to talk about them. And so this did a lot of damage to so many generations of men, but especially to this generation. Often you might hear they're called the silent generation, and this is why. They do not talk about their shit. And it was considered honorable. You weren't supposed to talk about it. You weren't supposed to mention your trauma. You weren't supposed to like burden someone else with your trauma. And these days we're starting to recognize that in fact that does not work, and drinking away your problems till you die is not the way to live. But this is a new thought. This is how we used to do things. So this idea that people were going to push it down, but it was going to come back was sort of prescient. Although, to be fair, he did write it 10 years later, so he knew what was going to happen. But this war was the first time that we really started to deal with the veterans and to deal with what had happened to them and the ways that we were outright not taking care of them. Because a lot of soldiers lost limbs, like this guy that you see in the picture below. London and Berlin, too, of course, were flooded with injured veterans, people who had lost limbs, but people who were also sort of mentally incapacitated as well. And there was no veteran service for them. These days, we do. We do have the VA. They're underfunded, and we should do a much better job about that. But in those days, they had nothing. So a lot of the soldiers came home from the war and had to deal with their mental trauma, had to deal with their physical trauma, and weren't getting any backup. So for him to acknowledge that this was happening was very offensive to the Nazis, because the Nazi Party, again, focused on the strength of the German man and the strength of the German soldier and like how great, Germans are mentally and physically. And so for someone to acknowledge that perhaps they might have some sort of like cracks in their armor was unacceptable. And that was one of the reasons that they got so mad about this book, was because he mentioned that mental trauma is going to happen. So next, I want to talk about the sort of extended conversation that they had, Paul and the other guys in his troop, about why they were at war, big picture. So they knew why they joined, like, small picture. They knew that they joined because they had sort of been talked into it, and because everybody else was joining, and because they wanted, to serve and to stand up and to be brave. But once they get to the war, they're sort of looking around, and they start to sort of like back up and have a much larger perspective about why we're having this war at all. So they have these really interesting conversations about it. So it starts with Krop, and he says it's queer when one thinks about it. We're here to protect our fatherland, and the French are over there to protect their fatherland. Now who's in the right? And so, well, for one thing, we change our ideas about what the word queer means every couple decades. So here it just means like the old school, like it's weird. Not that it was gay, but it was weird. And so basically Krop is examining this idea that people examined that same like Christmas Day that we talked about, where they were like, are these guys just like us? Like, we're protecting our fatherland and they're protecting their fatherland, and are they wrong? And this is kind of mind-blowing for Krop and for the other boys, because they had been fully indoctrinated to believe that the other guy was bad, and that they were right and the other guy was wrong. And so now when they get there and they're looking across the front lines at these guys who look like them, they're sort of like, oh, wait, I don't have a beef with that guy, and so in a sense they can understand the motives of the other soldier. They're like, oh, they must be fighting for the same reason that we're fighting. So further in the conversation, he says, true, but just to consider, almost all of us are simple folk. And in France, too, the majority of the men are laborers or workmen or poor clerks. Now, just why would a French blacksmith or a French shoemaker want to attack us? And this is, again, a really vital line of thought, this idea that they're just people, and those guys are just people. And under normal circumstances, one shoemaker would not attack another shoemaker. Like it's a weird thing for humans to do. Like most of the time, we leave each other alone. That's how we chill. But for a stranger to kill a stranger is a very unusual thing. That's not generally something that humans engage in, historically. And so he says, no, it is merely the rulers. I have never seen a Frenchman before I came here, and it will be just the same with the majority of the Frenchmen as regards us. They weren't asked about it any more than we were. So, again, one of the reasons that the Nazis hated this book was because of this line of thought. They didn't want people to think about the French as being just like them, or to think of really anybody as being just like them. They didn't want people to sort of consider themselves to be on a level playing field with anybody who wasn't German, or really even at this point who wasn't Aryan. So for this book to have these characters sort of having this realization that like, oh, like those guys aren't mad at me personally, and similarly, I am not mad at them personally, was very upsetting because it was not something that the German government wanted people to think about. They wanted them to assume that the other people were bad and they were evil and they were diseased and they were coming for you. So to have this thought that like, oh, that guy's just a guy, and like he doesn't know me and he doesn't care about this was kind of disenchanting. And that was really dangerous because they needed those soldiers to believe in this war, man. So the end of the conversation is again, it's still Tjaden and Kat. And he says, well, then what exactly is this war for? And Kat shrugs his shoulders and says, there must be some people to whom the war is useful. And Tjaden says, well, I'm not one of them. And Kat acknowledges, not you nor anyone else here. And that's, I would argue, kind of the central theme of the book. The war is not for them. The war is not for these soldiers. They don't hate these French dudes. They've never met these French dudes. They've never left their town. So the war must be useful for somebody. But you also have to acknowledge, okay, well, this war is not useful for me. So again, this is kind of one of the things that I want you to take from this book, is this idea that sometimes when you're looking at a situation, you can acknowledge, oh, well, this war must be useful for somebody. However, not me. And so that's one of the things that I want you to be able to sort of think critically about, to look at a situation and think to yourself, like, well, like, I don't see the point in this. And I am actively harmed by this, so why would we do it? And the answer is always, because it's good for somebody. This is a very important thing, especially to consider about our recent conflicts in Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan. When we think about it, like, do you hate Afghani people? No, you don't know anybody. But we're still at war. We've still been there for 19 years. And so who is this for? And this is, again, one of the things that we have to actively consider before we get into wars like this, because it's not for you. Probably. I don't know your situation, but probably you're not the one who's going to benefit from something like this. And so for these boys to be sitting there looking at the situation and be like, who is this for? Like, it's not for me. Like, I don't know any of these people, and I'm not making any money, and I'm not, like, gaining any wealth. So, like, who's this for? And the answer, by the way, is for those three guys. There's the German generals at the time of this war. So this conversation, I think, is probably the most important conversation in the whole book. So if you read no other part of the book, please read that part of the book, because this was one of the big things that got it banned, was this idea that these boys were thinking critically about their situation, and they were realizing that it wasn't what they were told that it would be. Okay. So the other thing that I wanted to address was the hospitals. So one of the things that we hear about when we hear about war is very much related to the battlefield. We know who the generals were, and we know where they fought, and we know who won, and we know what day it was. But very often we don't really hear about the aftermath, and we certainly don't hear about what's going on with the people who were injured and had to leave the battlefield. So in this war, we were still mostly losing the soldiers. We have become increasingly able to keep people alive. In the last few wars especially, we've gotten really far with like prosthetic limbs and with spinal surgery. But the hospitals in this war were a little bit more, I don't want to say primitive, because they were, pretty great in regard to medicine at that point in history, but they were still not able to do everything that we would like for them to do. And they didn't anticipate being so crowded. So very similar to, how we've been talking about they thought the Civil War would last like 2 weeks. They thought this war would last a couple months. So they didn't build the kind of hospital facilities that they needed. So one of the things that Paul notices when he's in the hospital is that his situation is not unique. So he says, this is only one hospital, one single station. There are hundreds of thousands in Germany, hundreds of thousands in France, hundreds of thousands in Russia. How senseless is everything that can ever be written, done, or thought when such things are possible? It must be all lies and of no account when the culture of 1,000 years could not prevent this stream of blood being poured out, these torture chambers and their hundreds of thousands. A hospital alone shows what war is. So for Paul, he's really dealing with this idea that we are supposed to be civilized. We've had 1,000 years to get our shit together, and still we are creating rivers of blood to solve our problems. And so basically he's saying, like, you know, he's looking around this hospital and he's like, look at all of these injured people. Look at all of this trauma. Look at all of this death. Like, is this really what we needed? Is this really the epitome of civilization? Like, is this how we solve our problems? And so for him to be able to sort of look around at the damage was symbolic of the whole war. So essentially where he landed was that a hospital shows us what a war is. And again, that's a hard thing, I think, for people to imagine who aren't in it. I mean, I have some pictures for you that I'll show you, but basically, when we think about war, we only think about certain things, and this is not one of them, because we don't want to think about this. Yeah, this is terrible and gross and bloody. And so, again, the point of the book is to force us to acknowledge things like this. It's to force us to acknowledge that this is really what happened in the war. This is really what happened to most of the soldiers. And so this is a German hospital. So when Paul was talking about, you know, that extended period of time that he spent in the hospital, I just wanted you to have a picture so you could sort of better imagine it. You know, they had figured out about blood transfusions, but I don't think they had IVs yet. And so you can sort of see how tightly packed into the room they are. And the level of care that they're getting is vastly better than what we got in the Civil War, but still not quite as good as we're expecting to see in the future. This is a British hospital. And it's basically the same. I just wanted to show you because I enjoy pictures. But again, you can see how many people are sort of packed into a room. And so one of the things that they tended to do was that they would have, you know, the hospitals where the surgeries are happening, and then a sort of like recovery wing, and then like a convalescent wing. So sometimes they would send people home. You may have seen people convalescing at like great houses in Britain. That was the thing for a while. The houses that were already so gigantic would take in soldiers who were like finished with their surgeries, but not yet ready to go back. Like they needed physical therapy essentially. And that was common everywhere. So these hospitals were massive, and they were always running out of supplies, and they were basically trying to tend to these exploded children. And the way that Paul thought about it was that it was totally unnecessary. And I think that's really interesting, because on the one hand, we made a lot of technological advancements in regard to healthcare in these two wars. But on the other hand, gosh, I wish we didn't have to. This is the final one that I wanted to show you, because sometimes they had to treat in the field. So what's going on here is that the two guys who are sort of in the, I just realized I can't point. The guy in the vest basically is getting one of his wounds sewn up. So basically, when you got into a situation where you couldn't quite get to the hospital, you had to treat things in the field. And so, again, the rivers of blood. All right. So the other thing that Paul is beginning to reckon with is that the war will end. And he's going to have to go home. And he's been at war for years and years and years. And so he's like, oh no, like what will happen when we go home? Because he realizes they don't have any skills. You know, these days, very often in the armed services, you learn, you know, things that will be useful later on. Like a lot of people join the army to get mechanical engineering degrees or to go into like nuclear engineering, which is really interesting, I think. But in this particular war, you didn't. You just kind of marched and marched and marched and then went home. So he said, what do they expect of us if a time ever comes when the war is over? Through the years, our business has been killing. It was our first calling in life. Our knowledge of life is limited to death. What will happen afterwards? What shall come of us? Because, again, they trained these boys to kill, and then they sent them out there to kill, and then there was sort of nothing else involved in their learning. And this is something that a lot of soldiers do struggle with. I mean, it's fair to acknowledge that these days the Army does try to teach other skills. But again, one of the things I'd like for you to think about in your interview paper was whether your particular veteran came home with any skills other than killing. Because one of the things that a lot of, especially in like Desert Storm and Iraqi war soldiers are dealing with is that they got real good at killing, and then they come home and they're not supposed to kill anybody anymore. They're sort of not sure what to do. You may have seen
I have an
movies about
example.
this.
I have an example.
Okay, Mr. Davidson, what's up?
My granddad was in the Navy right before the Vietnam War, and he came back with incredible cooking skills.
Well, that's actually useful. You may have seen some like movies lately about soldiers turning into contract killers. Ideally, this is not what happens, but sometimes this is what happens. So if you have this whole generation of people and the only thing that you teach them is how to like walk and how to shoot, again, you've done a disservice to your soldiers. So one of the things that Paul notices is that they are sort of prematurely aged. Not physically, well, sometimes physically, but mostly mentally. And so he notices that as people continue to join the front and they continue to join the soldiers, they're shocked at how young they are. And he's like, what? We're not young? He says, we are none of us more than 20 years old, but young, youth, that is long ago. We are old folk. And often, this is what happens when people face trauma. They're sort of forced to grow up more quickly than we would like for them to. They're sort of forced to reckon with adult things and feel adult feelings and do adult activities. And so for him, one of the things that he's noticing is that even though objectively they are young, they're 19, they're 20, they're still really old in their souls. So this picture, I think, is kind of a good example. These are some boys who were headed off to war. And to me, they look quite young. And lately, I've been really struggling with this when I see like soldiers in airports. I'm like, who are these children? We can't send children to war, but you'll notice when you get old. So objectively, like they're the right age to go to war. This is how old we want people to be when they go to war. But as you age, you sort of look at these people and you're like, oh, those are babies. Those are just tiny little babies. And so it's, again, horrifying to think that we sent these babies to war, we trained them how to kill, and we did nothing else. So for him, this acknowledgement that like they are not young anymore and they will never be young again is a way of sort of acknowledging that they are never going to be what they might have been without this war. They are never going to be, peaceful farmers the way that they thought that they would be as they were growing up. Which leads us to the final slide. So the way that the book ends is really dramatic, but it's dramatic in its calmness. So often we expect a movie or a book to end with like a great, big explosion finale. Like we're used to a sort of climax, and then generally speaking, the protagonist wins and goes home. That's what we like, right? That's how our first couple of movies ended. But this this book really ends on an anticlimax. It's one of the sort of most famous anticlimax endings of all time, because you're reading, and then you get to the last page and it switches to third person, and this is what they said. He fell in October 1918 on a day that was so quiet and still on the whole front that the Army report confined itself to a single sentence: all quiet on the Western Front. And so one of the things that they're trying to be clear about with this final part was that he died after the armistice. So technically the war was kind of over. Like it was right about to be over. Like this was kind of the end of things. Like fighting was not necessarily continuing in the same way that it had been for the entirety of the war. Like it was really the end. Like there was essentially no reason for him to die at this point. And he died in a totally anticlimactic way. And he just sort of fell. And it wasn't massive and it wasn't noble. It wasn't a massive like battle. Like very often when we talk about people dying at the war, we mention in what battle they died, because that's relatively common. It's like we say like, oh, that is the Battle of the Bulge. It was on the Somme. And for him, it was such a quiet day that there was only one sentence, and that sentence said, yeah, everything's chill.
Yeah, it's funny. The German, I read about it. The title of the book in German is Im Westen nichts Neues, which really translates to nothing new in the West, no, all quiet. So like really what they're saying here is like nothing new happened, and that kind of adds like a new layer of insignificance to his death. Like the Army report was, nothing really happened, one pointless death, and I find that kind of interesting.
Yeah. And I kind of wish that the translation had been more direct. Because to suggest that it was quiet suggests that there was like no firing whatsoever, but to suggest that there was nothing new suggests that there was firing and people died, but it was like, and so for Paul, his death occurred on just a day. And the movie, for some reason, they show him reaching for a butterfly. But I think the significance of it just sort of happening at random is actually very, very important, because this is what happened to a lot of soldiers. They died, it was a random day, now they're gone forever. And so we want, always we want for everything to be significant and for everything to have meaning and for everything to come full circle. And one of the things that I think is very important about this book is that sometimes it's not, man. Sometimes it's random, or it's pointless, or it's shitty. And I think that that's something that we have to continue to remember, because every time we send these boys to die in war, we tell them that it's going to be noble and it's going to be epic and there's going to be a climax. But the reality is not always that. And so this first person perspective of the inanity of the whole thing is very important. But again, super offensive to the Nazis. And this is one of the main reasons that they were pissed, because they wanted stories of nobility. Like, they would have preferred that Paul died, you know, doing something epic and defeating the enemy. And he didn't. He just died. And in that regard, it's just very, very real. So I'm going to unshare. Sorry about my dog. He's hungry. So
what kind of a dog is it? What kind of a dog is it?
He's a Karen Terrier. He looks like Toto.
Cool.
Yeah, he's the cutest dog in the world for sure. I'm just kidding. But the thing that I want you to kind of, again, keep in mind about this book is that if you did find it to be sort of a letdown, if you did find it to be an anticlimax, you were supposed to. We don't like that sort of thing, but at the same time, often that kind of thing is quite realistic. So if you're upset and depressed after you finish this book, on the one hand, like, I'm sorry, I know it's been quite a summer, and I bet that you would like a happy ending. But on the other hand, I think that that's the thing that's important about this book, is that it is real and it did all happen, and this is what it looks like for the people who are on the ground. So I'm going to stop the record button and check for